The Ahuizotl, the water beast that haunted Aztec lakes. The sun hangs low over Lake Texcoco, painting the water in shades of copper and blood. A fisherman crouches at the water's edge, his hands working to mend his net, the rhythm of his movements as ancient as the lake itself. The air is thick with the scent of algae and wet earth, and somewhere in the distance, a heron calls. But then, cutting through the evening sounds, comes another cry. A baby's wail. High-pitched, desperate, heart-wrenching. The fisherman's hands stop moving. He looks up, scanning the shoreline, the reeds swaying in the breeze. The cry comes again, closer now, more urgent. Somewhere in those rushes, a child is in terrible danger. His fishing net drops to the mud. He stands, takes a step toward the sound. Another step. The water laps at his sandals. The cry continues, pulling at something primal in his chest, the instinct to help, to save. He moves closer to the water's edge, knee-deep now in the shallows. The baby's voice seems to come from just beyond the next cluster of reeds. He reaches out to part them, and that's when he feels it. Something wraps around his ankle. Not rope, not plant. Something that feels like fingers, like a hand. Before he can scream, before he can even process what's happening, he's yanked forward with impossible strength. The water closes over his head. He sees nothing but murky darkness. He tries to kick, to struggle, but the grip is iron. Down, down, down into the depths of Lake Texcoco, dragged by something that should not exist. The baby's cry was never a baby at all. It was the hunting call of the Ahuizotl. Welcome to a journey into one of the most terrifying creatures ever to haunt Aztec mythology. Tonight, we're diving deep into the dark waters of Lake Texcoco to meet the Ahuizotl, a beast that blurred the lines between animal and demon, between nature and nightmare, between the physical world and the realm of the gods. This is not just a story about a monster. This is a story about water and power, about life and death in the Aztec world, about an entire civilization's relationship with the element that sustained them and the creatures they believed dwelled within it. We're going to explore every aspect of this incredible legend. We'll examine the historical sources that documented the Ahuizotl, including the remarkable Florentine Codex, one of the most important ethnographic works ever created. We'll walk the shores of Lake Texcoco as it existed in its prime, a vast watery world that has now vanished beneath the streets of Mexico City. We'll meet the water god Tlaloc and understand the Ahuizotl's role as his servant and friend. We'll investigate the bizarre specifics of how this creature hunted, what it ate, and what happened to those unlucky enough to become its prey. But we won't stop there. We'll also explore the fascinating possibility that the Ahuizotl might have been based on a real animal, examining the water opossum and other creatures that could have inspired this legend. We'll meet Emperor Ahuizotl, the powerful Aztec ruler who took this creature's name as his own, and we'll hear about the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortez's claim that one of his men was killed by an Ahuizotl. We'll trace this legend through history right up to the present day, seeing how it continues to echo through Mexican culture. By the time we're done, you'll understand why the Ahuizotl wasn't just a monster story designed to scare children away from dangerous waters. It was a crucial part of Aztec religious belief, a messenger of the gods, a guardian of the natural world, and a reminder that water, the source of all life, could also be the bringer of death. You'll see how this legend reflects the Aztec understanding of the universe, their sophisticated relationship with their environment, and their complex beliefs about death and the afterlife. So settle in, because this is going to be a long journey. We have depths to plumb, waters to navigate, and mysteries to unravel. And I promise you, by the end, you'll never think about lakes, rivers, or even the sound of a crying baby quite the same way again. Let's begin. Before we can understand the Ahuizotl, we need to understand its name. In the Nahuatl language, the tongue of the Aztecs and many other peoples of central Mexico, words carry layers of meaning built from roots that combine to create rich, descriptive terms. Nahuatl is what linguists call an agglutinative language, meaning it builds complex words by stringing together smaller meaningful units. It's a language of poetry and precision, where names tell stories. The word Ahuizotl comes from several Nahuatl roots. The most commonly cited translation is spiny aquatic thing or thorny water dweller. Let's break that down. The element Atl means water, the fundamental substance of life in Aztec cosmology. Huizotl refers to a thorn or spine, something sharp and dangerous. The suffix yotl denotes the essence or nature of something, the quality that makes it what it is. Put it all together and you get a creature defined by its watery habitat and its dangerous, spiny nature. Some scholars translate it slightly differently, as water dog or water monster, emphasizing the creature's aquatic nature and its beast-like qualities. Others focus on different nuances in the roots, suggesting meanings like the slippery one of the water or water thorny. What's fascinating is that all these translations captured different aspects of the same creature. It lived in water. It was dangerous, spine-like, sharp. It had qualities of a dog or beast. It was slippery, elusive, hard to grasp. This multiplicity of meaning wasn't a confusion or a mistranslation. It was intentional. Nahuatl names, especially names of mythological creatures and gods, were designed to evoke multiple layers of understanding simultaneously. When an Aztec person heard the word Ahuizotl, they didn't just think of a creature. They thought of thorniness and water, of danger lurking in the depths, of something that combined the familiar, a dog, with the alien, a water-dwelling predator. They thought of slipperiness, of things that couldn't be held or controlled. The name also had a practical dimension. In classical Nahuatl, Ahuizotl was applied to the water opossum, a real animal that we'll discuss in great depth later. This creature, known scientifically as Chironectes minimus, possesses many of the qualities the name suggests. It has water-repellent fur that can indeed look spiky when wet and then dried. It's an aquatic mammal, rare in its habits. It has dexterous, hand-like paws and a prehensile tail. The Aztecs knew this animal, hunted it, observed it, and gave it a name that captured its essence. But here's where it gets interesting. The mythological Ahuizotl, the creature of legend that we're exploring today, shares the same name as this real animal. Were they the same thing? Was the myth based on encounters with the water opossum, exaggerated and elaborated through centuries of storytelling? Or was the water opossum given the name of a pre-existing mythological creature because people saw similarities? This is one of the central mysteries we'll be investigating. What we know for certain is that by the time the Spanish arrived in central Mexico in the early 1500s, Ahuizotl referred to both a real animal and a legendary creature. The Spanish chroniclers, like Bernardino de Sahagun, whose work we'll examine closely, recorded both meanings. They described the water opossum as a natural animal in their catalogs of New World wildlife. But they also recorded the Aztec beliefs about a fearsome water beast called the Ahuizotl, a creature with supernatural powers and a taste for human flesh. The name also had royal significance. Around 1486, a man who would become one of the most powerful Aztec emperors took Ahuizotl as his regnal name. This wasn't his birth name. It was a name he chose or was given when he ascended to power. In Aztec tradition, rulers often took the names of animals, gods, or natural forces to associate themselves with certain qualities. Why would a ruler choose to be named after this particular creature? Emperor Ahuizotl, who ruled from 1486 to 1502, wasn't just any Tlaloc or speaker, as Aztec rulers were called. He was perhaps the greatest military leader the Aztec Empire ever produced. Under his rule, the empire more than doubled in size. He conquered territories from the Pacific coast to what is now Guatemala. He was swift, ruthless, and unstoppable in war. He was, in other words, exactly like the creature whose name he bore. The Ahuizotl didn't announce its presence. It didn't give warnings. It struck from beneath, from the hidden depths, with devastating speed and power. By taking this name, the emperor was making a statement. He was aligning himself with a creature that was feared and respected, that was connected to the gods, that represented the terrifying power of water itself. He was telling his enemies that he could strike from unexpected places, that he was relentless, that once he had you in his grasp, there was no escape. The name was propaganda, but it was also spiritual alignment. It connected the emperor to Tlaloc, the rain god, and to all the divine powers associated with water and fertility. This dual meaning of the name, referring to both an animal and a ruler, actually makes the mythological creature more complex. When Aztec people spoke of the Ahuizotl, they might be referring to the water creature, to the emperor, or to a conceptual connection between the two. This wasn't confusing to them. It was layered meaning, the way their language and thought worked. The emperor embodied the qualities of the creature. The creature exemplified the qualities a great ruler should have. And the real animal, the water opossum, was the physical manifestation in the natural world of these qualities that existed in both the mythological and political realms. There's also a deeper linguistic connection worth noting. The word for water, ATL, appears in countless Aztec words and names. It was one of the fundamental building blocks of their language because water was one of the fundamental building blocks of their world. The Aztecs built their magnificent capital, Tenochtitlan, on an island in Lake Texcoco. They surrounded themselves with water. They created chinampas, floating gardens, to grow their food. They built aqueducts to bring fresh water to their city. They worshipped water gods above almost all others. Water was life itself, but water was also death. The same lakes that provided fish and enabled agriculture could overflow and flood the city. The same rains that nourished crops could fail, leading to famine. People drowned. Children fell into canals. Fishermen disappeared. Water was a constant presence and a constant danger. So when the Aztecs named a creature Ahuizotl, they were naming something that embodied water's dual nature: life and death, sustenance and danger, the beautiful and the terrible. Understanding the name helps us understand the creature. The Ahuizotl wasn't just a monster in Aztec thought. It was water incarnate, water with will and hunger, water that could reach out and grab you. It was the personification of drowning, of the moment when the life-giving element becomes the life-taking one. It was every parent's fear when their child played too close to the canal's edge. It was every fisherman's nightmare when the weather turned dark and the waves grew high. And yet, paradoxically, it was also considered a servant of the gods, particularly Tlaloc, who was not evil but necessary. Tlaloc brought the rains that fed the people. The Ahuizotl, as Tlaloc's agent, brought souls to the water paradise of Tlalocan. The name encompasses all of this: thorn and water, danger and divinity, animal, myth, and ruler, all contained in a single Nahuatl word that ripples with meaning like the surface of Lake Texcoco itself. Now that we understand what the name means, let's look at what this creature actually was. What did it look like? How big was it? What were its distinguishing features? This is where the historical sources become absolutely crucial, and where we need to thank the remarkable work of Bernardino de Sahagun and his indigenous collaborators. According to the Florentine Codex, the most comprehensive and reliable source we have on Aztec culture, the Ahuizotl was roughly the size of a small dog. Not a tiny lap dog, but perhaps something like a medium-sized terrier or a small retriever. This is important because it means the creature wasn't some massive lake monster like a crocodile or sea serpent. It was a manageable size, something that could conceivably exist in the lakes around Tenochtitlan without being constantly visible. A creature this size could hide in reed beds, could slip through underwater caves, could lurk in the shadows of the Chinampas. The fur of the Ahuizotl was described as waterproof, which makes perfect sense for an aquatic creature. But more specifically, the sources tell us that this fur had a remarkable quality. When the Ahuizotl emerged from the water and shook itself, the way a dog shakes off after a swim, its fur would clump together and stand up in spikes or thorns. This is where part of the name comes from, that spiny or thorny quality. Imagine a creature pulling itself up onto the bank, water streaming off its body, and its entire coat bristling outward like a porcupine's quills. It would be a distinctive and slightly disturbing sight. The color of this fur varied in the descriptions, but most sources agree on a marbled pattern of black and gray or black and brown. Some accounts mention waterproof fur that looked almost oily or sleek when wet, with a natural water-repellent quality that kept the animal's skin dry even when it was fully submerged. This marbling pattern would provide excellent camouflage in the murky waters of Lake Texcoco, where light filtered down in dappled patterns and shadows played across the muddy bottom. The head of the Ahuizotl featured small, pointed ears, quite different from the rounded ears of many aquatic mammals. These ears were described as being able to close when the creature dove underwater, protecting the ear canals from water infiltration. The snout was somewhat elongated, good for rooting around in mud and among rocks in search of prey. The eyes were dark and set close together, giving the creature decent binocular vision for judging distances when striking at prey. But the most distinctive, most disturbing, and most frequently mentioned feature of the Ahuizotl was its tail. This was no ordinary tail. The sources are remarkably consistent on this point. The Ahuizotl's tail was long, muscular, and prehensile, meaning it could grip and hold things. But that's not the shocking part. The shocking part is what was at the end of that tail. At the tip of the Ahuizotl's tail was a hand. Not a paw, not a fin, a hand. A human-like hand with fingers that could grasp and hold. This is described in the Florentine Codex and repeated in multiple Spanish chronicles. Some sources say the hand looked like a monkey's hand, with opposed thumb and dexterous fingers. Others describe it as more human-like, but smaller, like the hand of a child. All agree that this hand was the Ahuizotl's primary weapon and tool. Think about how disturbing this would be. You're standing at the water's edge, and something wraps around your ankle. You look down and see fingers. Human-like fingers emerging from the water, attached to a tail, belonging to some creature you can't even see yet beneath the surface. That image alone would fuel nightmares for generations. And the Aztecs had the artistic and descriptive capability to make this image vivid. In stone carvings and codex illustrations that survive, you can sometimes see the Ahuizotl depicted with this distinctive tail hand, making the creature instantly recognizable. This prehensile tail hand wasn't just for show. It was the Ahuizotl's primary hunting tool. The creature could use this appendage to reach out from hiding places, to snag the ankles of unsuspecting victims, to hold onto struggling prey with a grip that reportedly could not be broken. The tail was long enough and flexible enough that the Ahuizotl could grab someone from a surprising distance, catching people who thought they were safely away from the water's edge. The front limbs of the Ahuizotl also had hands rather than paws, though these were more clearly animal hands rather than human-like ones. The sources describe them as being like a raccoon's or a monkey's hands, very dexterous and capable of manipulation. These hands had 5 fingers each, and the creature could use them to hold prey, to pull apart food, and to climb along rocky shorelines or among the roots of lakeside trees. Now, let's talk about the mouth, because this is where things get particularly grim. The Ahuizotl had sharp fangs, described as being like a dog's teeth, but more numerous and more pointed. These fangs were the tools it used to perform its most disturbing characteristic, its peculiar appetite. You see, the Ahuizotl didn't eat its victims in the conventional sense. It didn't devour the flesh. It didn't tear the body apart for meat. Instead, it had a very specific taste. It consumed only 3 parts of the human body: the eyes, the teeth, and the fingernails and toenails. Let that sink in for a moment. This creature would drown its victim, using that tail hand to hold them underwater until they stopped struggling. Then, using its sharp fangs and dexterous hands, it would extract the eyes from the skull, pull the teeth from the jaw, and tear or bite off the nails from the fingers and toes. Everything else, the entire rest of the body, would be left intact. After a few days, this mutilated corpse would float to the surface of the lake, a gruesome message from the depths. Why these specific body parts? The Aztec sources don't explain this as a simple dietary preference. These body parts had significance. Eyes were associated with seeing, with knowledge, with the sun. Teeth were necessary for eating, for life. Nails were where the body met the world, the hardened edges of our soft flesh. In Aztec thought, these weren't random choices. They were ritual removals, each carrying symbolic weight. Some sources suggest that the Ahuizotl collected these body parts for Tlaloc or for the Tlaloc, the rain god's helpers. The eyes, teeth, and nails were offerings, tributes from the watery realm to the divine powers. This transforms the Ahuizotl from a simple predator into something more like a priest, performing ritual sacrifices in service of higher powers. The creature was not just killing. It was conducting ceremonies, gathering sacred materials from the bodies of those chosen by the water gods. The overall build of the Ahuizotl was streamlined and athletic. It needed to be a strong swimmer, capable of moving silently through water and striking with sudden speed. When it moved on land, which it did rarely, it moved on all 4 limbs with a shambling gait, its tail dragging behind or curling upward. But in the water, it was grace itself. The webbed feet, the powerful tail, the sleek waterproof fur all contributed to make it a perfect aquatic predator. The size, again, is worth emphasizing because it's easy to let our imaginations run wild and picture some enormous lake monster. But the Ahuizotl was small dog-sized. This makes it more terrifying in some ways, not less. A small creature can hide in places a large one cannot. It can slip into narrow crevices, can lurk in shallow water that seems too small to contain a threat. It can strike from unexpected angles. And there's something particularly unsettling about a small creature being able to overpower and drown a full-grown human being. When you picture the Ahuizotl, picture something sleek and dark moving through murky water. Picture pointed ears just breaking the surface as it swims. Picture those dexterous hands on its forelimbs reaching out to test the texture of a submerged rock or piece of wood. And most of all, picture that tail, that impossible tail with its human-like hand, extending outward through the water, fingers flexing, searching for the feel of human ankle, human leg, human flesh. The Aztec artists who illustrated the codices understood how to make this creature visually distinct. In surviving images, you can see the pronounced tail hand, often shown in mid-grasp. You can see the marbled fur pattern, the pointed ears, the sharp-toothed mouth. These weren't just artistic flights of fancy. They were based on detailed descriptions, on a clear visual understanding of what this creature was supposed to look like. Whether that understanding came from observing a real animal and elaborating on it, or from pure mythological imagination, the result was a creature that was consistent, describable, and absolutely distinctive. Ahuizotl was succeeded by his nephew, Moctezuma II, who would be the emperor who met Cortez and who would witness the destruction of everything Ahuizotl had built. Moctezuma II ruled during the catastrophe. Ahuizotl ruled during the Golden Age. It's a pattern we see throughout history. The conqueror builds the empire, and his successor watches it fall. But back to our central question, why did this emperor choose the name Ahuizotl? What was he trying to communicate? And what does it tell us about how the Aztecs understood this creature? First, it tells us that the Ahuizotl was seen as powerful and fearsome. You don't name yourself after something weak or contemptible. The creature's reputation for strength, for relentlessness, for striking from hiding and never letting go once it had its grip. These were all qualities a warrior emperor would want to embody. Second, it connected the emperor explicitly to Tlaloc and the water gods. This wasn't just military power. This was religious authority. Ahuizotl was saying that he ruled with divine favor, that the gods of water and fertility blessed his reign. Given how important water was to Aztec agriculture and survival, this connection was immensely valuable politically. Third, it sent a message to enemies. If you opposed this emperor, you would be hunted. You would be dragged down. You would be overwhelmed. The Ahuizotl didn't give up. It didn't retreat. It gripped and held and pulled until the victim drowned. That was the threat Emperor Ahuizotl embodied. Resistance was futile. Surrender was the only option. The fact that Emperor Ahuizotl adopted the creature as his personal emblem, having it depicted on shields and stone monuments, shows that this wasn't just about a name. It was about crafting a complete image, a brand, an identity. When people saw the image of the Ahuizotl, with its distinctive tail hand and fierce appearance, they thought of the emperor. The creature and the ruler became intertwined in public imagination. There are surviving stone carvings from Ahuizotl's reign that show the creature. At the National Anthropology Museum in Mexico City, you can see shields and monuments bearing the Ahuizotl's image. These aren't crude sketches. They're carefully crafted artworks that show the creature's characteristic features: the dog-like body, the hand at the end of the tail, the fierce expression. The artists who made these knew exactly what the Ahuizotl was supposed to look like, and they rendered it with skill and precision. Emperor Ahuizotl also had a glyph, a kind of pictographic signature that incorporated the creature's image. In Aztec writing systems, names were often represented through glyphs that combined phonetic elements with pictorial ones. Ahuizotl's name glyph typically showed the water creature, making the connection explicit and unmistakable. When official documents or inscriptions needed to reference the emperor, this glyph would appear, once again reinforcing the association between man and monster. This naming practice, taking the name of a powerful creature or force of nature, was part of a broader Aztec tradition. Rulers often had names that connected them to the divine or the powerful. Moctezuma means he frowns like a lord. Ahuizotl means obsidian serpent. Tlaloc means he who makes sacrifices, or the chalk-colored one. These names weren't arbitrary. They were chosen or given to reflect the ruler's character, aspirations, or destiny. But Ahuizotl is particularly interesting because it's a name that combines fear and divinity, violence and sacred purpose. The creature was terrifying, but it was also doing the gods' work. It killed, but it killed to populate paradise. It was a servant of forces greater than itself. All of this transferred to the emperor when he took that name. He was terrifying, but righteously so. He was violent in service of the gods. He was a force of nature, like water itself, necessary, powerful, and dangerous. When we study Emperor Ahuizotl, we're not just learning about a historical figure. We're learning about how the Aztecs understood power, divinity, and the natural world. We're seeing how they used mythology and symbolism to structure political authority. We're witnessing the interplay between legend and reality, between stories about monsters and the stories leaders tell about themselves. And we're reminded that the Ahuizotl wasn't just a boogeyman story told to scare children away from the water. It was a central element of Aztec culture, important enough that an emperor would stake his identity on it, powerful enough as a symbol to resonate across all levels of society, from peasants to priests to the ruler himself. The creature was real in the most important sense. It was real in the minds and hearts of the Aztecs, shaping their behavior, their beliefs, and their world. One of the most intriguing pieces of evidence about the Ahuizotl comes from an unlikely source: Hernán Cortés, the Spanish conquistador who conquered the Aztec Empire. In a letter to King Charles V of Spain, Cortés reported that one of his men had been killed by an Ahuizotl. This single mention raises fascinating questions. What did Cortés mean? What did his soldier encounter? And what does this tell us about how the Spanish understood or misunderstood Aztec beliefs? First, let's set the scene. Cortés and his expedition arrived on the coast of Mexico in 1519. Over the next 2 years, they would make their way inland, forge alliances with groups hostile to the Aztecs, fight their way to Tenochtitlan, be driven out in the famous Noche Triste, or Night of Sorrows, and finally besiege and conquer the city in 1521. Throughout this period, Cortés was sending letters back to Spain, describing the lands he was exploring, the peoples he was encountering, and the events of his conquest. These letters served multiple purposes. They were reports to his king, justifying the expedition and the conquest. They were propaganda, making Cortés look heroic and capable. They were also attempts to make sense of an utterly foreign world, to describe in Spanish terms things that didn't fit into any European framework. When Cortés wrote about Aztec religion, about human sacrifice, about the city of Tenochtitlan with its canals and causeways, he was trying to communicate experiences and observations that no European had ever made before. So when Cortés writes that one of his men was killed by an Ahuizotl, we need to ask, what exactly was he reporting? Did he believe that a mythological water monster had literally attacked and killed one of his soldiers? Did he use the Nahuatl term because he didn't know how else to describe what happened? Was he repeating what his indigenous allies or interpreters told him? Or was this a misunderstanding, a mistranslation, a cultural collision where Spanish and Nahuatl concepts got confused? The most straightforward interpretation is that one of Cortés's soldiers drowned, and either Cortés was told by the Aztecs that this death was the work of an Ahuizotl, or he had learned enough about Aztec beliefs to use that term himself. In a world before modern forensics, before autopsies, before scientific understanding of death and decomposition, attributing a drowning to a mysterious water creature would not have seemed unreasonable, especially to a 16th century Spanish conquistador who believed in demons, saints, miracles, and divine intervention. Remember that the Spanish of Cortés's era had their own rich folklore of dangerous creatures. They believed in demons that could take physical form, in witches who could curse and kill, in all manner of supernatural threats. The concept of a water-dwelling creature that killed people was not foreign to European thought. Spain had legends of water spirits and dangerous lake dwellers. So when Cortés heard about the Ahuizotl, it probably didn't sound impossibly alien. It fit into his existing mental framework of dangerous spiritual entities. However, Cortés was also a skeptical, practical man in many ways. He dismissed Aztec religion as devil worship and superstition. He tore down idols and built churches. He had no patience for what he saw as pagan nonsense. So why would he report an Ahuizotl killing as fact rather than as an example of Aztec superstition? One possibility is that he was simply repeating what he was told without editorializing. His man drowned. The Aztecs said an Ahuizotl did it. Cortés reported this in his letter as an interesting local belief or claim, not necessarily endorsing it as truth. The statement might have been more like, "The Indians claim my man was killed by an Ahuizotl," than "My man was definitely killed by an Ahuizotl." Another possibility is that there was something unusual about the death that made even Cortés wonder. Perhaps the body showed the distinctive mutilations associated with Ahuizotl attacks: missing eyes, teeth, and nails. Perhaps it was found in a location where drownings were common and where the Aztecs specifically said Ahuizotls lurked. Perhaps there were witnesses who claimed to have seen something in the water. Any of these factors might have made Cortés take the claim more seriously, or at least think it was worth mentioning to the king. There's also the possibility of a language and translation issue. Cortés worked with translators, most famously La Malinche, a Nahua woman who spoke both Nahuatl and Maya and who learned Spanish. When the Aztecs or their allies spoke about what happened to the soldier, they might have used the word Ahuizotl, but meant it in different ways. They might have meant the mythological creature. They might have meant the real animal, the water opossum. They might have been using Ahuizotl as a general term for dangerous water conditions or water-related deaths. The translation chain from Nahuatl to Maya to Spanish, or from Nahuatl to Spanish, was long and prone to errors and misunderstandings. Concepts didn't always map neatly across languages. When Cortés wrote Ahuizotl in his Spanish letter, he was probably using the Nahuatl word because he didn't have a good Spanish equivalent. How do you translate a word that means simultaneously water dog, spiny aquatic thing, and mythological servant of the rain god who drowns people and eats their eyes, teeth, and nails? You don't. You just use the Nahuatl word and let the reader make of it what they will. What's interesting is that Cortés mentions this death at all. His letters are full of dramatic events, battles, political intrigue, the marvels of Tenochtitlan, the horrors of human sacrifice. For a single soldier's death to merit mention, it must have struck Cortés as noteworthy in some way. Perhaps it was early in the expedition, when every loss felt significant. Perhaps the circumstances were particularly strange or disturbing. Perhaps Cortés was trying to convey to the king just how dangerous and alien this new world was, where even the lakes held monsters. After the conquest, as Spanish chroniclers worked with indigenous informants to document Aztec culture, the Ahuizotl appears in their writings as well. As we've discussed, Bernardino de Sahagun and his collaborators included it in the Florentine Codex. Other chroniclers mentioned it in their accounts. These post-conquest sources are more detailed and more clearly distinguish between the Ahuizotl as a real animal and the Ahuizotl as a mythological creature, but there's still ambiguity in how the two are related. The Spanish attitudes toward indigenous knowledge were complicated and contradictory. On one hand, they saw indigenous beliefs as pagan superstition that needed to be eradicated so Christianity could take root. They destroyed countless codices and artifacts, burned temples, and suppressed native religion. On the other hand, they were genuinely curious about this new world and its peoples. They wanted to understand what they had conquered. They recognized that indigenous knowledge about plants, animals, geography, and medicine was valuable and worth preserving. So Spanish chroniclers record information about the Ahuizotl with a kind of arm's-length fascination. This is what the Indians believe, they're saying. Whether it's true or not is another matter, but it's worth documenting. This creates a complex historiographical situation where we're reading Spanish accounts of Nahua beliefs, filtered through Catholic worldviews and Renaissance ideas about natural history and the supernatural. For the indigenous people who survived the conquest, beliefs about the Ahuizotl would have persisted but evolved. The physical landscape was changing dramatically. The Spanish were draining the lakes. The population had been devastated by European diseases. The old religious practices were being suppressed. But stories, beliefs, and folklore are resilient. They adapt and survive even when the culture that created them is under assault. The Ahuizotl legend probably did continue in modified forms in the decades and centuries after the conquest. Parents still warned children about the dangers of water. People still drowned in the shrinking lakes and canals. Stories about what lurked in those waters would have continued to circulate, even as Christianity overlaid and mixed with the older beliefs. The creature might have become less explicitly connected to Tlaloc and the Aztec gods and more of a generic water monster, but the core narrative, the basic fear, would have remained. Cortez's mention of the Ahuizotl, brief as it is, serves as a bridge between the pre-conquest Aztec world and the Spanish colonial period. It's a moment where indigenous belief and European observation intersected, where a conquistador acknowledged, even if skeptically, the reality of a creature from Aztec mythology. It reminds us that history isn't just made of battles and treaties. It's also made of these small moments of cultural encounter, where people from radically different worldviews try to understand each other and often fail, but in failing leave us records that we can study centuries later. Whether Cortez's soldier was killed by an actual Ahuizotl, whatever that might have been, by an attack attributed to an Ahuizotl, or simply drowned in circumstances that reminded people of Ahuizotl attacks, we can't know for certain. But the report itself is valuable. It tells us that the Ahuizotl was real enough, important enough, that even the Spanish conquerors knew about it and took it seriously enough to mention in official correspondence to the King of Spain. That's a kind of validation, a proof that this creature occupied a significant place in the mental landscape of both the conquered and the conquerors. Now we come to one of the most fascinating aspects of studying the Ahuizotl, the strong possibility that this legendary creature was based on, or at least inspired by, a real animal that still exists today. Let me introduce you to Chironectes minimus, the water opossum, also known as the yapak, one of the most remarkable and unusual mammals you've never heard of. The water opossum is the only truly aquatic marsupial in the world. Think about that for a moment. Marsupials are the pouched mammals, kangaroos, koalas, wombats, possums. Most of them are terrestrial or tree-dwelling. But the water opossum has evolved to live a semi-aquatic lifestyle, spending much of its time in and around freshwater streams, rivers, and lakes. It's the evolutionary equivalent of if a kangaroo decided to become a beaver. Let's start with where this animal lives. The water opossum's range stretches from southern Mexico through Central America and down into South America, reaching as far south as Argentina. In Mexico, it's found in the southern states, Oaxaca, Chiapas, Veracruz, and occasionally farther north. This means that water possums lived in territories that were part of or near the Aztec Empire. The Aztecs almost certainly encountered this animal, particularly in the conquered southern provinces that Emperor Ahuizotl added to the empire. Now let's look at the physical description of this animal and compare it to the legendary Ahuizotl. Remember, the mythological creature was described as being roughly the size of a small dog. The water opossum's body length is about 27 to 40 centimeters, roughly 10 to 16 inches, with a tail that's about the same length or slightly longer. That's actually pretty close to small dog-sized, maybe like a small terrier. Not enormous, but not tiny either. The fur of the water opossum is described as dense and water-repellent, with a marbled pattern of black and gray or black and brown. When the animal emerges from the water and shakes itself dry, the fur does tend to stand up in clumps and spikes. This matches almost perfectly with the Florentine Codex's description of the Ahuizotl's waterproof fur that spikes up when the creature shakes off water. The ears of the water opossum are relatively small and rounded, and they can close when the animal dives underwater. The legendary Ahuizotl was described as having small, pointed ears that could close underwater. This is very close, with only minor discrepancy in the ear shape. Now we come to the most distinctive feature, the tail. The water opossum has a long, muscular, partially prehensile tail. While it doesn't have an actual human hand at the end, the tail is indeed prehensile, meaning it can grasp and hold objects. The yapak uses its tail to carry nesting materials, for balance while swimming, and for manipulating objects. If you saw this tail in action, especially in dim light or murky water, especially if you were already predisposed to believe in creatures with hand-tipped tails, you might very well interpret it as having a hand-like appendage. But here's where it gets really interesting. The water opossum's forepaws. These are highly dexterous, with opposable digits that function very much like hands. They're described as being similar to raccoon hands or monkey hands in their ability to grasp and manipulate objects. This matches exactly with the Florentine Codex description of the Ahuizotl having monkey-like hands on its forelimbs. The water opossum is an excellent swimmer. It has partially webbed hind feet that it uses to propel itself through the water with powerful, alternating strokes. It can hold its breath and dive underwater to hunt for prey. It's active primarily at night, emerging from its den at dusk to hunt through the dark hours. All of this matches the behavior attributed to the mythological Ahuizotl. What does the water opossum eat? This is crucial to our comparison. The yapak is primarily carnivorous, feeding on fish, freshwater shrimp and crayfish, aquatic insects, frogs, and occasionally small mammals. It's an active hunter, using its sensitive whiskers and paws to locate prey in the water, often hunting by touch in murky or dark conditions. It has sharp teeth for catching and eating its prey. Now, the mythological Ahuizotl was said to eat specifically eyes, teeth, and nails from human victims. The water opossum obviously doesn't do this. But here's where we need to think about how legends develop and how people interpret what they see. If bodies recovered from water showed damage to soft tissues, particularly around the eyes, mouth, and extremities, and if people knew that an animal like the water opossum inhabited those waters, they might attribute that damage to the animal, even if it was actually caused by decomposition, scavengers like fish and crabs, or other factors. The water opossum does scavenge when the opportunity presents itself. While it primarily hunts live prey, it will feed on dead animals it finds. If a water opossum encountered a human corpse in the water, it might indeed nibble on exposed soft tissues. The eyes, being soft and nutritious, would be particularly attractive. The gums around teeth, the soft tissues around nails. these would all be accessible and edible. Could a water opossum cause the specific mutilation pattern associated with Ahuizotl victims? Probably not exactly, but close enough that if you were looking for evidence that an Ahuizotl had been at work, you might find it convincing. The water opossum makes its den in riverbanks or loch shores, excavating burrows just above the waterline with entrances a few inches above the surface. These dens descend at about a 45-degree angle into the bank, with a tunnel about 60 centimeters long leading to a nesting chamber lined with leaves and grass. This matches the description of the Ahuizotl living in caves and deep pools near the water's edge. Here's another fascinating detail about the water opossum that might have contributed to the legend. Both males and females have pouches. This is extremely unusual in marsupials. Typically, only females have pouches for carrying their young. But male water possums have evolved a pouch as well, though it serves a different purpose. When the male swims, he tucks his genitalia into this pouch to protect them and to streamline his body for more efficient swimming. The female's pouch is even more remarkable. It's watertight. She can seal it shut with a ring of muscle, creating a completely dry environment for her babies even when she's fully submerged. This allows her to dive and hunt while carrying her young, something no other marsupial can do. This watertight pouch could easily be mythologized into stranger features, particularly if people didn't fully understand what they were seeing. The water opossum is largely solitary and very secretive. It's nocturnal and shy, avoiding human contact whenever possible. Sightings are rare even today in areas where the animal is known to live. This elusiveness would have made it mysterious and easy to mythologize. People would know it existed, would occasionally see signs of it or catch glimpses of it, but would rarely get a clear, extended look at the animal. This is perfect fodder for legend building. The real animal becomes the seed around which stories and elaborations can grow. So here's a plausible scenario for how the Ahuizotl legend might have developed based on the water opossum. The Aztecs encounter this strange animal in the southern regions of their empire or in territories they trade with. It's unlike any other animal they know. It's a marsupial, but they don't have that category, so they describe it as dog-like. It lives in water like a fish, but has fur like a land mammal. It has prehensile tail and hand-like paws. It's active at night. It's rare and secretive. It inhabits the same places where people drown. When people drown and their bodies are recovered days later, showing damage to soft tissues, particularly around the eyes, mouth, and extremities, the Aztecs make a connection. This strange water-dwelling creature with its hand-like appendages must be responsible. The animal becomes associated with drowning deaths. Over time, the association strengthens and elaborates. The creature becomes an intentional predator of humans, not just an opportunistic scavenger. It develops supernatural abilities, the power to mimic a baby's cry, to make fish jump, to serve the gods. The religious and mythological framework builds around this real animal kernel. The creature becomes explicitly connected to Tlaloc and the water gods. Its killings become sacred acts, ways of collecting souls for Tlalocan. The specific mutilation pattern becomes a ritual rather than simple scavenging. The taboos about touching the bodies develop. Over generations, the real animal and the mythological creature become increasingly distinct, though they share the same name and many physical characteristics. This process of elaborating a real animal into a mythological creature is common across cultures. The Komodo dragon inspired dragon legends in Indonesia. Encounters with giant squids probably contributed to kraken myths. Crocodiles show up in mythologies around the world as dragons or monsters. fossils of extinct megafauna have been interpreted as the bones of giants or mythological beasts. The line between natural history and mythology was much blurrier in pre-modern societies than it is today. There's even a specific precedent for this in Mesoamerican cultures. The feathered serpent, Quetzalcoatl, combines real snakes with elaborated, mythologized features. Jaguars are both real animals and sacred creatures with divine associations. The Aztecs were perfectly capable of seeing animals as simultaneously physical and spiritual entities, as having both natural and supernatural dimensions. Several scholars have specifically identified the water opossum as the likely inspiration for the Ahuizotl legend. Mayan archaeologist Eric Thompson suggested this connection in an unpublished manuscript decades ago. More recent researchers who have studied both the water opossum's biology and the historical descriptions of the Ahuizotl have come to similar conclusions. The match is just too close to be coincidental. However, we shouldn't oversimplify. The mythological Ahuizotl is more than just an exaggerated water opossum. It has features and abilities that can't be explained by the real animal. The human-like hand at the tail tip, for instance, goes beyond a prehensile tail. The specific appetite for eyes, teeth, and nails is more ritualized and purposeful than anything a scavenging marsupial would do. The ability to cry like a baby or make fish jump suggests consciousness and intent that an animal wouldn't have. So while the water opossum probably inspired the legend, provided the physical template, and explained some of the behaviors attributed to the mythological creature, the Ahuizotl as understood by the Aztecs was more than just a yapok. It was a yapok plus centuries of storytelling, plus religious elaboration, plus all the cultural work of explaining drowning and incorporating water deaths into the Aztec cosmological framework. The water opossum today is classified as least concern by the IUCN, meaning it's not currently at risk of extinction, though its populations are declining in some areas due to habitat loss and water pollution. It still lives in the remnants of the lakes and rivers where the Aztecs once encountered it. In the places where Lake Texcoco once spread for miles, there are now just small pockets of wetland where creatures like the yapok might still survive. The vast aquatic ecosystem that supported both the water opossum and the civilization that mythologized it is largely gone, drained, and paved over to create modern Mexico City. But the animal persists, and with it persists the possibility of understanding how the real and the mythological intertwine, how encounters with nature can seed legends that outlive the landscapes that created them. The water opossum is a living link to the Ahuizotl legend, a reminder that myths don't spring from nowhere, but from real observations, real encounters, real attempts to understand a world that's simultaneously ordinary and filled with wonder. While the water opossum theory is compelling, it's not the only explanation that's been proposed for the Ahuizotl legend. Over the years, various scholars and researchers have suggested alternative animals that might have inspired the myth, or have argued that the creature was purely mythological with no real animal basis. Let's examine these other theories and see how they hold up. The otter hypothesis was one of the earlier attempts to identify a real animal behind the Ahuizotl legend. The southern river otter, Lutra longicaudis, does live in Mexico, including in areas that were part of the Aztec Empire. Otters are skilled swimmers, have long tails, are active hunters of fish and other aquatic prey, and can be aggressive when threatened or cornered. They're about the right size, roughly similar to a small dog. They're primarily active during dawn and dusk, which could account for the nocturnal associations of the Ahuizotl. However, the otter hypothesis has significant problems. First, otters don't have prehensile tails. Their tails are flat and rudder-like, used for swimming and steering, but they can't grasp objects. This is a major deviation from the most distinctive feature of the Ahuizotl. Second, otter fur is solid brown or gray, not the marbled black and gray pattern described for the Ahuizotl. Third, otters have small rounded ears, not the pointed ears mentioned in some Ahuizotl descriptions. Fourth, while otters do have dexterous paws, they're not typically described as hand-like the way the Ahuizotls were. Most crucially, the Florentine Codex actually has a separate entry for the otter, calling it Ahuizotl in Nahuatl. The Aztecs knew what otters were, described them separately, and didn't confuse them with the Ahuizotl. If the Ahuizotl legend had been based on otters, why would the same sources that describe the Ahuizotl also describe otters as a completely different animal? The beaver theory is even less convincing. Beavers are excellent swimmers and have waterproof fur, which matches the Ahuizotl description. But that's about where the similarities end. Beavers are vegetarians, feeding on bark, twigs, and aquatic plants. They have flat, paddle-like tails that are definitely not prehensile and certainly don't end in anything resembling a hand. They have prominent rodent teeth, very different from the sharp fangs attributed to the Ahuizotl. And beavers are builders, known for their dams and lodges, behaviors that are never mentioned in connection with the Ahuizotl. Furthermore, beavers native to Mexico are not the same species as North American beavers, and their historical range in central Mexico is unclear. It's possible the Aztecs didn't encounter beavers at all, or only rarely. Like the otter, this theory fails to account for the most distinctive features of the Ahuizotl, particularly the prehensile tail hand. Another animal that has been mentioned in some discussions is the Mexican axolotl, the famous salamander that was prized as food by the Aztecs and that's now critically endangered. The axolotl lives in the lakes around Tenochtitlan, including Lake Texcoco. It's an unusual creature with distinctive features and the ability to regenerate limbs, which might contribute to mythological associations. But the axolotl is far too small to account for the Ahuizotl legend. Axolotls are typically only 6 to 9 inches long. They're not aggressive to humans. They don't have hands or prehensile tails. They're not dog-sized. The connection just doesn't work. Some researchers have suggested that the Ahuizotl legend might be based on multiple animals combined into one mythological creature. Maybe the body comes from a water opossum, the hunting behavior from an otter, the swimming ability from some other creature, all blended together through storytelling into a composite monster. This is certainly possible. Mythological creatures often combine features from multiple sources. The griffin combines an eagle and a lion. The chimera has parts from a lion, goat, and serpent. Maybe the Ahuizotl is similar, but the composite theory has its own problems. The Ahuizotl descriptions are remarkably consistent. The creature has specific, distinctive features that appear again and again in different sources. It's not a vague combination of various water animals. It's a well-defined creature with clear characteristics. This consistency suggests either a single animal inspiration or a purely mythological creature that was carefully maintained through oral tradition and eventually written documentation. This brings us to the pure myth theory. Some scholars argue that the Ahuizotl was never based on a real animal at all. It was entirely mythological from the start, created to explain drowning deaths and to embody the dangers of water in Aztec cosmology. In this view, any similarities to real animals are coincidental or resulted from storytellers trying to make the creature sound plausible by giving it realistic features. The pure myth theory has some strengths. It accounts for the obviously mythological features: the hand at the tail tip, the ability to cry like a baby, the power to make fish jump, the specific ritual appetite for eyes, teeth, and nails, the sacred status and connection to Tlaloc. These elements clearly go beyond any real animal. They're products of imagination, religion, and cultural meaning-making. Furthermore, the Aztecs had plenty of other purely mythological creatures. They believed in all sorts of supernatural beings that were never confused with real animals. Sapactli, the primordial sea monster from creation myths, is pure mythology. Quetzalcoatl in his fully divine form goes way beyond the real Quetzal bird and real snakes. The Aztecs were perfectly capable of creating and maintaining belief in creatures that had no physical existence. However, the pure myth theory struggles to explain why the Ahuizotl is described with such specific, realistic physical details. Mythological creatures often have fantastical, exaggerated features. They're enormous, or they have multiple heads, or they're made of elements like fire or wind. The Ahuizotl, despite its supernatural abilities, is described as a relatively normal-sized animal with fur, ears, teeth, and limbs. This specificity suggests some kind of observational basis, some real creature that was observed and described, even if it was then elaborated with mythological attributes. The strongest theory, in my assessment and in the assessment of most scholars who have studied this question in depth, remains the water opossum with mythological elaboration. The physical match is too close to ignore. The geographic overlap between the water opossum's range and Aztec territories is significant. The ecological fit, with both the real animal and the mythological creature inhabiting similar watery environments, makes sense. And we have the precedent of the Aztecs using the same name, Ahuizotl, for both a real animal, which they clearly distinguished in natural history contexts, and a mythological creature. What probably happened is that the Aztecs encountered the water opossum and were struck by how unusual it was. Here was a furry, mammalian creature that lived in water like a fish, had hand-like paws, and a prehensile tail. That initial encounter with a genuinely strange real animal provided the foundation. Then, over time, as people drowned in lakes and their bodies showed damage from decomposition and scavengers, the connection was made. This strange water creature must be responsible. The legend grew from there. Religious and cultural needs shaped the elaboration. The Aztecs needed to explain drowning in ways that fit their cosmology. They needed creatures that served the water gods. They needed beings that could ferry souls to Tlaloc. The water opossum, already mysterious and somewhat frightening, was perfect for this role. It was real enough to be plausible, strange enough to be supernatural, and aquatic enough to be connected to Tlaloc and water worship. The result was a creature that existed on multiple levels. There was the natural animal, the yapak, which hunters and naturalists knew about and could describe accurately. There was the mythological Ahuizotl, with its God-given powers and sacred purpose. And in the middle, there was probably some confusion, some blurring of the lines, some people who thought the mythological creature and the real animal were the same thing, while others understood them as related but distinct. This layered understanding is characteristic of Aztec thought. They didn't insist on rigid categories. Something could be both real and symbolic, both physical and spiritual, both natural and divine. The Ahuizotl exemplifies this worldview. It was, simultaneously, a strange marsupial that occasionally scavenged corpses and a divine servant that collected souls for paradise. Both were true from the Aztec perspective. Both were the Ahuizotl. The Ahuizotl wasn't just a creature in Aztec culture. It was a symbol, a metaphor, a teaching tool, and a way of understanding fundamental aspects of the Aztec world. To fully appreciate this legend, we need to examine what the creature represented beyond its role as a water predator and servant of Tlaloc. At the most basic level, the Ahuizotl represented the danger of water. This might seem obvious, but it's worth unpacking. For the Aztecs, who built their civilization in and around Lake Texcoco, water was omnipresent. Children grew up playing near canals. Adults worked on the lake daily. Everyone traveled by canoe. Water was unavoidable, and water was dangerous. People drowned regularly. Canoes tipped over. Children fell in. Strong swimmers got pulled under by currents or entangled in vegetation. The Ahuizotl gave this danger a face and a name. Instead of abstract drowning risk, there was a specific creature to fear. This specificity made the danger more real, more tangible, especially for children. Stay away from the water's edge or the Ahuizotl will get you is much more effective than be careful near water. The creature turned a general warning into a vivid, memorable threat. But the Ahuizotl also represented something more complex, the dual nature of water itself. Water gives life. It makes crops grow, provides fish to eat, offers transportation routes, enables the chinampas that fed Tenochtitlan. But water also takes life. It floods, it drowns, it destroys. The same element is both nourisher and killer. The Ahuizotl embodied this duality. It was terrifying, a predator and a taker of life. But it was also a servant of Tlaloc, part of the divine system that brought rain and fertility. It killed, but it killed for sacred purposes, sending souls to paradise. This kind of dual symbolism is central to Aztec religious thought. Many of their gods were simultaneously creative and destructive. Tlaloc brought life-giving rain and destructive floods. Quetzalcoatl was both a wise culture hero and a force of cosmic destruction. Coatlicue was both mother of gods and a terrifying death figure. The Aztecs understood that power, whether divine or natural, was inherently ambiguous. It could create or destroy, save or kill, bless or curse. The same force, just directed differently. The Ahuizotl fit perfectly into this framework. It wasn't evil. It was powerful and dangerous, but it served the greater cosmic order. Its killings were necessary, part of the cycle of life and death that sustained the universe. This is a very different understanding of predation than we typically have in modern Western culture, where predators are often cast as villains and prey as innocent victims. For the Aztecs, the Ahuizotl wasn't a villain. It was doing exactly what it was supposed to do, playing its role in the grand scheme. The creature also served as a guardian of the lakes and their resources. One telling of the Ahuizotl legend explicitly describes it as the guardian of lakes, whose purpose was to protect the fish within them. This adds an ecological dimension to the myth. The Ahuizotl was enforcing a kind of natural order, ensuring that humans didn't overfish or disrespect the waters. Fishermen who hoarded their catch, who took more than they needed, who failed to make proper offerings to the water gods. These were the people the Ahuizotl targeted. This ecological guardian role reflects the Aztecs' generally sophisticated understanding of resource management. They had complex rules about harvesting resources, about when and where you could fish or hunt, about tribute and distribution of goods. The Ahuizotl legend reinforced these rules. If you disrespected the water and its bounty, if you took without giving back, the guardian would punish you. The creature became a supernatural enforcement mechanism for ecological and social norms. There's also a class dimension worth noting. The Ahuizotl attacked people who were at the water's edge: fishermen, washerwomen, people drawing water, farmers working chinampas. These were primarily common people, not nobles or priests. The legend reflected and perhaps validated the dangers that working-class Aztecs faced daily. Their lives brought them into constant contact with water, and that contact carried risks. The Ahuizotl acknowledged those risks, made them seen and significant. At the same time, the special status of Ahuizotl victims, the fact that they were destined for Tlalocan and couldn't be touched by common people, elevated drowning victims above the typical dead. In most Aztec cosmology, warriors and women who died in childbirth had special afterlife destinations. Most other people went to Mythical, the underworld, regardless of how virtuous they'd been in life. But drowning victims got to go to paradise. This meant that a humble fisherman, a common washerwoman, could achieve an afterlife destination usually reserved for the honored dead. The Ahuizotl, by claiming these victims, was paradoxically elevating them. The creature appeared in Aztec art and iconography in various forms. Stone carvings showed it with its distinctive tail hand. Shields bore its image. The emperor's name glyph incorporated it. In all these contexts, the Ahuizotl served as a visual shorthand for concepts like danger, divine power, water, and sacred death. Seeing the creature's image would trigger all these associations in the mind of an Aztec viewer who knew the legends. The specific mutilation pattern, the removal of eyes, teeth, and nails, also carried symbolic weight. These weren't random body parts. In Aztec thought, different parts of the body had different spiritual and practical significance. Eyes were how you saw the world, how you engaged with visual reality. Taking them marked the transition from the world of light to the watery darkness of Tlaloc's realm. Teeth were tools of survival, necessary for eating, for processing food, for life itself. Removing them signified the end of earthly need and the beginning of existence in a paradise where food was abundant and effortless. Nails were the hardened edges where soft flesh met the external world. Taking them might represent the soul's separation from physical existence, the loosening of the connection between body and world. This ritualized mutilation pattern turned what could have been simple animal scavenging into sacred surgery, a careful, purposeful transformation of the victim's body to prepare them for their new existence in Tlalocan. The Ahuizotl wasn't just killing and eating. It was performing a ceremony, a rite of passage, a transformation. The creature's hunting methods, particularly the false baby cry, carried their own symbolic weight. The ability to mimic innocent, helpless sounds to lure victims speaks to themes of deception and the danger of misplaced compassion. The world, the legend teaches, is not always what it seems. Calls for help might be traps. Apparent innocence might mask predation. You must be careful, must be discerning, must not let your emotions override your judgment. This is a harsh lesson, but perhaps a necessary one in a world as dangerous as the Aztecs. The lakes were beautiful but deadly. The empire was powerful but surrounded by enemies. Survival required constant vigilance. The Ahuizotl's deceptive cry was a reminder of that necessity, a warning that danger could come disguised as helplessness. The creature also symbolized the limits of human control. The Aztecs were master engineers and builders. They constructed Tenochtitlan on an island in a lake, created the Chinampas, built aqueducts, managed water levels with complex systems of dikes and sluice gates. They reshaped their environment to an extraordinary degree. But the Ahuizotl represented forces they couldn't control, couldn't engineer away, couldn't master through technology or organization. Water would always be dangerous. Drowning would always happen. Some things were beyond human power to prevent. This acknowledgement of limits is important. It kept hubris in check. It reminded even the most powerful, even the emperor himself, that they were subject to forces greater than themselves. Emperor Ahuizotl learned this lesson when his aqueduct project flooded the city and led to his own death. The creature whose name he bore taught him that water cannot be fully controlled, that attempting to master it can lead to catastrophe. In all these ways, the Ahuizotl functioned as what anthropologists call a multivocal symbol, something that carried multiple layers of meaning that could be interpreted in various ways depending on context, that spoke to different aspects of Aztec culture and belief. It was simultaneously a monster and a servant of the gods, a threat and a promise of paradise, a predator and a priest, an animal and a spiritual being, a cause of fear and a source of meaning. This richness of symbolism is part of what made the legend so durable and powerful. It wasn't just a simple scary story. It was a complex cultural text that taught lessons, reinforced norms, explained phenomena, provided meaning for tragedy, and connected people to the divine. Every layer of the symbol reinforced the others, creating a thick web of meaning that pervaded Aztec culture. The Aztec Empire fell in 1521. The lakes began to be drained. The old religion was suppressed. Tenochtitlan was destroyed and Mexico City built on its ruins. The Ahuizotl's habitat disappeared, and the culture that created the legend was devastated. Yet the legend didn't entirely vanish. It adapted, evolved, and survived in various forms, leaving traces that we can still detect in Mexican culture today. One of the most visible modern references to the Ahuizotl appeared in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in the form of a revolutionary satirical publication called El Hijo del Ahuizotl, which translates to the son of the Ahuizotl, or the son of the water beast. This periodical, published in Mexico City, was fiercely anti-government and anti-Porfirist, criticizing the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz, who ruled Mexico from 1876 to 1911. Why would revolutionary satirists name their publication after an Aztec water monster? The choice was deliberate and meaningful. By invoking the Ahuizotl, they were connecting themselves to indigenous Mexican heritage, to pre-Columbian power, to something distinctly Mexican that predated Spanish colonial influence. They were saying, "We are the children of this ancient force. We carry its dangerous legacy. We will drag down the oppressors, just as the Ahuizotl dragged down those who disrespected the waters." The publication featured sharp political cartoons and biting commentary. It used the Ahuizotl's image, sometimes depicting political figures being grabbed by the creature's tail hand and pulled into water. The symbolism was clear. The old corrupt order would be drowned, pulled under, destroyed. The creature that had served Tlaloc would now serve the revolution, cleansing Mexico of tyranny. This appropriation of Aztec mythology for political purposes was part of a broader movement in Mexican culture, particularly after the Mexican Revolution of 1910, to reclaim indigenous heritage and identity. For centuries, Spanish colonial culture had dominated, treating indigenous peoples and cultures as inferior, shameful, to be hidden or suppressed. But in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Mexican intellectuals, artists, and activists began deliberately embracing their indigenous roots, celebrating Aztec and Maya culture as sources of pride and identity. The Ahuizotl, with its fierce power and its distinctly Mexican origins, was perfect for this cultural project. It wasn't a European monster. It wasn't derived from Christianity or classical mythology. It was purely Mexican, rooted in the land and waters of central Mexico, connected to gods that Europeans had tried to erase. Reclaiming the Ahuizotl was an act of cultural resistance and renewal. Beyond this specific political usage, the Ahuizotl persisted in Mexican folklore, particularly in communities that maintain stronger connections to indigenous traditions. In the 20th century, anthropologists and folklorists collected stories from regions around the Valley of Mexico, where people still told tales of water creatures that grabbed people and pulled them under. These stories weren't always explicitly identified as being about the Ahuizotl, but they carried clear echoes of the old legend. The water's edge is dangerous. Creatures lurk below. Certain deaths are chosen by forces beyond human understanding. Parents in some communities still warn children about water monsters, though the details have often blurred and mixed with other folkloric traditions. The specific features of the Ahuizotl, the tail hand, the ritual mutilations, the connection to Tlaloc, these have mostly faded from popular memory. But the core idea, the water is dangerous and inhabited by things that want to pull you down, remains. This persistence of the basic narrative pattern, while specific details fade, is typical of how folklore evolves over time. The exact features of the monster matter less than its function. To scare children away from danger, to explain drowning, to remind people to respect the water. The Ahuizotl legend has transformed into various generic water monster stories that serve these same purposes, even though the people telling them might not know the name Ahuizotl or the creature's Aztec origins. In academic and cultural heritage contexts, the Ahuizotl has received renewed attention in recent decades. Museums in Mexico City include exhibits about Aztec mythology that feature the creature. The National Museum of Anthropology displays stone carvings showing the Ahuizotl. Educational materials about pre-Columbian Mexican cultures often mention it as an example of Aztec belief systems and the importance of water in their cosmology. Modern Mexican artists have drawn on the Ahuizotl legend for inspiration. Painters, sculptors, writers, and filmmakers have created works that reimagine or reference this creature. Some present it in traditional ways, trying to accurately depict what the Aztecs believed. Others use it metaphorically, as a symbol of environmental destruction, cultural loss, or the violence lurking beneath modernity's surface. There's also been some interest in the Ahuizotl in broader popular culture, particularly in media that explores cryptozoology, the study of hidden or unknown animals, and in fantasy fiction. The creature occasionally appears in books, games, or shows that draw on Mesoamerican mythology. Usually in these contexts, the Ahuizotl is presented as a straightforward monster, stripped of its religious and cultural significance, but the exposure helps keep the name and basic concept alive in global consciousness. However, these popular culture references often miss the depth and complexity of the original legend. They turn the Ahuizotl into just another scary monster, equivalent to a generic water demon from any culture. They lose the specific Aztec context, the connection to Tlaloc and Tlalocan, the sophisticated symbolic and religious dimensions that made the creature meaningful to the people who originally believed in it. Perhaps the most profound modern legacy of the Ahuizotl isn't in specific cultural references, but in what the legend teaches us about environmental loss. The vast lake system that was the creature's habitat is gone. Lake Texcoco, once covering over 600 square miles, is now reduced to less than 1% of its former size. The clear waters where fish jumped and birds swirled have been replaced by urban sprawl. Mexico City, one of the world's largest metropolitan areas, sprawls across what was once lake bed. This environmental transformation has had enormous consequences. Mexico City faces chronic water shortages despite being built on what was once a lake. The city sinks several inches every year as groundwater is extracted faster than it can be replenished. The soft lakebed sediments make the city especially vulnerable to earthquakes. Air pollution is worsened by the loss of the lake's cooling and humidity moderating effects. Unique species like the axolotl are now critically endangered, their habitat destroyed. When we study the Ahuizotl legend, we're reminded of what was lost when the lakes were drained. We're confronted with the Aztecs' sophisticated relationship with water, their understanding that it was precious and dangerous, that it needed to be respected and carefully managed, that it was central to life itself. The Ahuizotl embodied that relationship, that understanding. When the habitat disappeared, the creature that symbolized it became impossible to sustain in living belief. Yet there are efforts, small but significant, to restore pieces of what was lost. The Lake Texcoco Ecological Park project, announced in recent years, aims to restore wetlands on the site of the former lake. It won't bring back the vast aquatic ecosystem that existed before the conquest, but it's a recognition that something valuable was destroyed and that some attempt at restoration or memorial is needed. The Ahuizotl legend, in this context, becomes not just a historical curiosity, but a reminder and a warning. It reminds us that indigenous peoples had deep knowledge of their environments, sophisticated beliefs and practices for living in balance with dangerous natural forces. It warns us about the costs of environmental destruction, about what happens when we drain the lakes and pave over the wetlands and forget the relationships our ancestors had with water. Every culture has its water monsters, its lake and river guardians, its stories about the dangerous depths. The Ahuizotl is Mexico's particular version, uniquely shaped by Aztec beliefs, by the geography of the Valley of Mexico, by the political and religious structures of the empire that thrived there. The legend is both specific to its time and place, and also universal, speaking to fears and concerns that humans everywhere share: the danger of water, the mystery of death, the power of forces we cannot control. The fact that we can still access this legend through the Florentine Codex and other colonial sources, through art and archaeology, through the continuing research of scholars, is itself remarkable. It represents a continuity across catastrophe, a persistence of knowledge despite conquest and suppression and environmental destruction. The Ahuizotl survives, not as a living belief, but as cultural memory, as academic subject, as symbol and metaphor available for contemporary use and interpretation. And perhaps, just perhaps, in the minds of people who live near the remnant wetlands, in stories told to children, in half-remembered warnings about the water's edge, the Ahuizotl still lives in some form. Changed, simplified, disconnected from its Aztec origins, but still present. Still the guardian of the waters. Still the hand that reaches up from below to pull the unwary down. Still teaching the eternal lesson: respect the water, for it gives life, but it can also take it away. We've traveled a long path through the dark waters of Lake Texcoco, examining every aspect of the Ahuizotl legend we could find. We've seen the creature through Aztec eyes, a servant of Tlaloc, a guardian of the lakes, a ferry to paradise. We've examined the historical documents that preserve knowledge of this being. We've explored the vanished ecosystem it inhabited. We've met the emperor who took its name. We've investigated the real animals that might have inspired it. And we've traced its echoes through Mexican culture to the present day. So what can we conclude about the Ahuizotl? What does this legend tell us about the Aztecs, about mythology, about the relationship between humans and their environment? First, the Ahuizotl demonstrates the sophistication and complexity of Aztec religious thought. This wasn't a simple, crude belief system. The Aztecs had developed a rich cosmology with multiple levels of heaven and underworld, with dozens of gods and supernatural beings, with elaborate rituals and detailed myths. The Ahuizotl fit into this system as one piece of a vast theological puzzle, connected to water worship, to agricultural cycles, to death practices, to social hierarchies. The creature was simultaneously physical and metaphysical, an animal that might really exist, the water opossum, and a divine being that served cosmic purposes. The Aztecs didn't need to resolve this ambiguity. They were comfortable with things existing on multiple levels simultaneously. This multi-layered thinking allowed them to be both practical naturalists who knew their environment in detail and mystical believers who saw divine purpose in everything. Second, the Ahuizotl reveals the central importance of water in Aztec culture. Everything we've discussed, from Tlaloc's power to the construction of Tenochtitlan to the Chinampas to the Ahuizotl itself, centers on water. For the Aztecs, water wasn't just a substance or a resource. It was divine presence, life itself, and constant danger. They built an entire civilization around and upon water, managing it with impressive engineering while also worshiping it with elaborate rituals. The Ahuizotl embodied all the ways the Aztecs thought about water, as sustainer and destroyer, as pathway to paradise and agent of death, as divine medium and physical environment. Every encounter with water was potentially an encounter with the Ahuizotl, which meant every encounter with water carried spiritual weight. This made every mundane activity, from fishing to drawing water to crossing a canal, into something significant, something that connected you to forces much larger than yourself. Third, the legend shows us how cultures use stories to structure behavior and create meaning. The Ahuizotl wasn't just entertainment. It served practical purposes. It kept children away from dangerous water. It explained drowning deaths in ways that fit Aztec cosmology. It reinforced social norms about offerings to the gods and respect for nature. It gave priests special authority and status. It connected individuals to the divine realm. It provided comfort to grieving families by assuring them their drowned loved ones had gone to paradise. All of these functions made the legend useful, and that utility helped it survive and spread. Stories that serve no purpose tend to die out. Stories that meet needs, answer questions, solve problems, these are the ones that persist through generations. The Ahuizotl legend persisted because it was doing cultural work, fulfilling functions that Aztec society needed fulfilled. Fourth, the Ahuizotl reminds us of the role observation of nature plays in mythology. The water opossum, with its genuinely unusual characteristics, probably provided the seed for this legend. The Aztecs were acute observers of their environment. They noticed things, categorized them, tried to understand them. When they encountered an animal as strange as the yapak, they paid attention, incorporated it into their understanding of the world, and elaborated it into something larger. This demonstrates that myths aren't just made up from nothing. They're rooted in real encounters with real things. Then imagination, cultural needs, religious frameworks, and generations of storytelling transform those encounters into something more complex and meaningful. The Ahuizotl is both real, the water opossum exists, and mythical, the tail hand, the sacred role, the divine connections are elaborations. Both dimensions are important. Focusing only on the real animal misses the cultural meaning. Treating it as pure fantasy ignores its natural history roots. Fifth, the fate of the Ahuizotl legend. It's fading from active belief, but preservation in historical records and cultural memory teaches us about cultural survival and loss. When the Spanish conquered the Aztec Empire, they didn't just defeat an army or capture a city. They shattered an entire worldview, suppressed a religion, disrupted knowledge systems that had developed over centuries. Much was lost forever, but not everything. Documents like the Florentine Codex, the work of people who saw value in preserving indigenous knowledge even as their world was ending, saved crucial information. The Ahuizotl legend survived because Bernardino de Sahagun and his indigenous collaborators wrote it down, because artists illustrated it, because it was important enough to be worth documenting. This act of preservation across cultural catastrophe is itself remarkable. It means that we, 500 years later, thousands of miles away, can still know what the Aztecs believed about this creature. We can still hear their voices, filtered through translation and time, telling us about the dangerous waters and the hand that reaches up from the depths. That continuity, that bridge across centuries and cultures, is precious. Finally, the Ahuizotl challenges us to think about our own relationship with water and nature. The Aztecs understood that water gave life but could also take it, that nature was powerful and needed to be respected, that human beings were not masters of their environment but participants in it, subject to forces beyond their control. These understandings, embodied in the Ahuizotl legend, feel especially relevant in our current moment of environmental crisis. We've drained the lakes, just as the Spanish did. We've paved over wetlands. We've engineered rivers and built dams and treated water as a commodity to be exploited rather than a sacred trust to be stewarded. And we're facing the consequences: water scarcity, ecosystem collapse, climate change. Maybe we need a new Ahuizotl, a new embodiment of water's power and danger, to remind us what the Aztecs knew: that water must be respected, that nature has its own agency, that there are limits to human control. The Ahuizotl was a teacher, and its lessons remain relevant. Respect the water. Understand that power is dual-edged. Recognize that death is a transition, not just an ending. Know that you are part of larger systems, subject to forces greater than yourself. Don't let fear prevent you from engaging with the world, but don't be so confident that you ignore the dangers. The water gives life, but it can also take it away. Always be aware of what lies beneath the surface. This has been a long journey through dark waters, examining this remarkable legend from every angle we could manage. We've learned about Aztec religion, about pre-Columbian ecology, about the Florentine Codex, about water possums, about cultural memory and loss. We've met an emperor and a conquistador. We've explored a vanished landscape and traced a legend through 5 centuries. All because of this one creature, the Ahuizotl, the water beast with the hand on its tail. If you've made it this far, thank you. Thank you for taking this journey with me, for diving into these depths, for caring enough about this piece of Aztec mythology to spend hours exploring it. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Ahuizotl, please hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel if you want more content exploring mythology, folklore, and the strange stories humans tell to make sense of their world. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, your questions, or your own encounters with water monster legends from other cultures. Share this video with anyone who loves mythology, Aztec history, or just great stories well told. Remember the Ahuizotl. Remember what the Aztecs understood: that the world is full of mystery, that water is both friend and foe, that death is not always the end. And the next time you're standing at the water's edge, at a lakeshore or a riverbank, and you hear something that might be a baby crying, that might be just the wind, that might be nothing at all, take a moment before you investigate. Look carefully at the water. Watch for ripples. And remember the hand that might reach out from below, the tail hand of the Ahuizotl, still waiting after all these centuries, ready to pull the unwary down into the dark waters and ferry them to the paradise that awaits. Thank you for watching. Until next time, Stay curious, stay safe, and never forget, the depths hold secrets we've only begun to understand.